Thank you, Kate. I was told I had to put the microphone on, so I had to plug that in real quick. As a great lead-in as well, my presentation today, wrapping up a day of excellent symposium presentations, is on the railroads of Prince William County. And I think this is probably the broadest time span we'll be covering, and we'll try and cram it all into 45 minutes, thereabouts. As we're going to be starting out in 1834, and we're going to be wrapping up in 1991. So we will get started by going back even further than I said we're going to go back. Because to really kind of understand how the railroads came to Prince William County, we need to talk a little bit about what came before. We'll go back to the 1780s. The new former American colonies, now the new somewhat United States, are looking westward into Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Indiana, Illinois. But in addition to simply getting people to settle out there, which is good, the states, especially in the East, Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania, have plenty of Revolutionary War soldiers that need to be paid off, and plenty of people that want to seek new land westward. But the problem then becomes, once they're settled and they're self-sufficient, they would like to make some money. And they'd like to sell their surplus farm products somewhere and be able to do that. However, people are settling where there are not accessible riverways to get by boat all the way from the interior of West Virginia, or all the way in the interior of southern or central Ohio, or Kentucky, all the way easily to one of the major rivers. So the nation turns to canals. Not quite to the Erie Canal yet, but perhaps famously the Potomac Canal and the James River and Kanawha Canal in Virginia are going to be two of the leading projects that are going to occupy the public perception and the state's funding efforts for the next almost 50 years. And from the fact that we know Potomac Canal especially, today the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal is built over part of that route. The James River and Kanawha Canal, despite the state funding more than 3/5 of the project, footing the bill, essentially writing it off as a public infrastructure improvement, with the idea of linking Richmond and the James River tidal portion all the way westward through what's now West Virginia to the Ohio River at Charleston, Kanawha River, and then down to the Ohio. Never happened. They built a turnpike, they built parts of a canal, but the project is never really finished. It's such a massive undertaking, engineering, cost-wise, funding. Neither project, despite having very prominent support from people like George Washington, George Mason, Henry Cabell, never really take off and succeed. Now, that brings us up to the 1820s and more in the time frame that we're starting off with. England has already very well established railroads by this portion. They start as wagonways, which the US has originally as well, which are either horses or gravity and rope arranged systems, mainly serving mining operations, coal mines, iron mines, copper mines that are on top of a hill, and then lowering the goods down either to a road or to a river to be loaded up and transported. Well, in England, they start putting steam boilers on top of some of those wagons and arranging them with cylinders and crankshafts to propel themselves, and what at the time is considered a fairly terrifying, noisy conglomeration of equipment. But they refine the process, they refine the equipment, locomotives, and by the 1820s, the United States is going to charter its first railroad companies in 1826 and 27 in New York, in New Jersey, and South Carolina, and then a few years later in Maryland and the Baltimore and Ohio as well, and start building some of the first locomotives. This is a woodcut of the best friend of Charleston, the first locomotive built in the United States, and also the first locomotive to be catastrophically detonated in the United States. Steam locomotives, part of the reason they don't catch on very quickly is they are fantastically dangerous, and the equipment to monitor their safety has not been refined very well. It's a very delicate balance of having enough steam pressure to drive the cylinders and actually pump the wheels and make the thing go, but also not turning it into an overpressurized time bomb that explodes. So unfortunately, the best friend of Charleston does just that. But the other locomotives that come out at the same time are going to be successful enough to drive the industry onward. In Virginia, that means a major change in the mind of the most significant man when it comes to planning these major infrastructure projects, Claudius Crozet. He's a former French Army engineer, came to the Americas after a long and successful career under General Napoleon, and later Emperor Napoleon. You can understand why he then comes to the United States in the 18-teens, after his former employer is now out of a job, so is he. He comes to the US, he teaches engineering for a while, but then Virginia hires him away from West Point to help do the major surveying and designing work for a lot of its infrastructure projects. And when he arrives, he's very strongly on board with the canal projects, with the Potomac Canal, the James River Canal. He doesn't really see another feasible way to transport big, heavy bulk goods to market where they can actually be sold and make a profit. However, in his 8-year term as principal engineer of the state of Virginia, he does a complete 180. As the technology has improved and as it's become cheaper and more widespread, his final report that he'll file in 1831 before Virginia functionally fires him is that all of these canal projects, all the millions of dollars that have been spent on them, have been okay, but it's time to move on. The projects are clearly spinning their wheels and not going anywhere. So the state's going to save a lot of money by turning that remaining mileage into a railroad. The state then brings in an engineer from New York who says that's ridiculous. Railroads are never going to be a functioning technology over that much of a distance. And Mr. Crozet decides this is a good time to exit his employment with the state of Virginia and move down to Louisiana. But just 3 years later, the state has already chartered its first 7 railroads. And the one that's going to be relevant to us first is going to be the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad Company. Chartered in 1834, the RF&P, I'm not going to say Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac too many times. The RF&P is very emblematic of those early railroads. Its charter and its objectives are fairly limited. Richmond to Fredericksburg, not on to Washington, but on to a suitable landing on the Potomac or one of its branches to connect to a steamship line to take it the last mileage to the city of Washington. The investors in this company, before they seek a charter, they have an engineer go and survey the routes they might potentially use, and they decide it's just not technologically or economically feasible to make the whole distance a railroad in 1834. So they start construction, fundraising in 1834. By 1842, they actually reach their first landing connection on the Potomac at Aquia Harbor, or Aquia Creek. From there, the journey to Richmond costs you $4 in 1840s currency, and you have to buy an additional $3 steamboat ticket if you want to get to Washington. Quickly rises up to about $10, but then by the 1850s, it's dropped down to about $5.50, one-way ticket for an individual passenger. Freight rates are about 3 to 4 cents a mile, and that's where the company hopes to make their money, serving the agricultural customers and businesses in Fredericksburg and Richmond and intervening towns along the way. 1861, I think everyone in the room here knows why that's a significant year. For the RF&P, that pretty much quashes their service and their hopes of extending the line north from Aquia Harbor. Because in the intervening 20 years, they've realized, as the technology has improved yet again, we can get all the way to Washington City. And we also have a non-competition clause from the state that lets us do that without having to worry about someone else horning in on that business line. But when the war rolls around in 1861, of course, understandably, they don't actually do any construction work during the war years. And as the campaigns seesaw back and forth through Northern Virginia, they eventually lose more and more mileage back down the line. It also doesn't help, they don't know it at the time. Their road maintenance foreman, the guy who takes care of all the tracks and bridges and everything, he's a US Army spy. He's a unionist, but he kept quiet through the early war years and then was able to pretty much continue sabotaging the RF&P's efforts throughout the Civil War. And that's a whole other talk in itself. But in 1872, after the war, the company's been recapitalized, especially with a lot of northern investors, and they decide to start building their line north from Aquia, and in 72, they reach Quantico, right at the bottom tip of Prince William County. And some of the first development that's going to happen there around the steamboat landing is going to be a landing for the RF&P ferries going up to Washington City. And the resort area is going to develop kind of in conjunction with that. But it's not until 1877 that they actually stop having the ferry service to Washington. Up until 1877, their connection at Quantico is a rail connection, but it's with a competing company. It's actually the Philadelphia and Washington, or Philadelphia, Washington, and Potomac. It's owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad of Pennsylvania. And it takes that 5-year time span for them to actually agree to use the same tracks and eventually buy out Pennsylvania's shares in that line. And that does not happen until 1890 when they fully acquire rights to that line. And it's not until 1920 that they officially become unified all along the way as the RF&P and not various subordinates and shell companies. So we'll move on to a name that's more familiar on this end of the county, the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, a little bit later competitor in the field. From 1848 onward, the railroad line is going to be built as the name describes, from Orange to Alexandria. Seems kind of odd today when we think of that as kind of going from the city to kind of out in the middle of the countryside. Which is how it was in 1848. The entire objective of the O&A is to serve this whole stretch of Northern Virginia that has not had railroad service. They've been either boating goods down to Fredericksburg, or they've been taking them by road to Fredericksburg or even Richmond, rather than having a route to the Potomac through Alexandria or Dumfries for many years. So, the first step is actually locating a route the railroad tracks will follow. Has particular Prince William County significance because the hope is, of course, to build business and build prominence. That railroad will run right through Prince William County and hopefully right through our courthouse at Brentsville. It does not run through the courthouse town at Brentsville. The railroad surveyors, as they're looking at the broad run crossing options, realize on one side of the river at Brentsville, there is a stretch of floodplain. And on the other side, there are some fairly high bluffs. There's not really a convenient crossing point close to the courthouse, or if there is, they have to cross two of the streams then to get along their way. So instead, they push the line west. They bypass pass through a plantation called Tudor Hall, which is then going to become more significant with the next railroad we're going to talk about. But then they proceed on their way down in steps to Orange, which they reach by 1854, and the line is complete for about 90 miles. However, they're not satisfied with that. It's been great. They have a connection with the Virginia Central Railroad that runs to Richmond, but they have their eyes looking further south. There's no railroad serving between Charlottesville and Lynchburg, and at Lynchburg you have the key rail connections to Tennessee and Kentucky, and from there into the deep south and North Carolina, along the Richmond and Danville, and eventually along the Weldon Railroad to North Carolina. So to build business and interconnectivity, it's advantageous to reach Lynchburg. And the state permits that in 1860, that they will be allowed to build to Lynchburg. Of course, 1861, back to the Civil War again, but the line has also been finished to Lynchburg with under a year. It shows you an idea of how far technology has progressed in just a decade, where to almost double their railroad in size only took them about a year of construction effort. 1873 is significant to the O&A because while the RF&P exists under that name until 1991, the O&A is going to disappear in 1873. It's going to become the Orange, Alexandria, and Manassas Gap. And then a few years later, it's going to become the Virginia Midland, and then the Richmond and Danville, and eventually, in 1893, will become the Southern Railway, part of the Southern Railway. So, summarize that a little bit. The photo there, I didn't talk about on the last page. Illustration there, that is a U.S. military railroad car float in Aquia Harbor, where they were boating equipment and supplies down from Washington to Aquia, and then serving U.S. Army posts further south. And this is the O&A yard, depot, machine shop, locomotive shop. Again, during the Civil War, U.S. military railroad equipment there in the yard. But the shop area had not really changed all that much in the 10 years it's been in operation. That is a true round house in the back. It's just one big circle with one little tiny entrance. So this brings us to the Manassas Gap Railroad. 1851, not long after the O&A was chartered, the desire was to build off of that eventual railroad and access an entire new market. So in this case, the objective is going to be Strasburg in the Shenandoah Valley and eventually on to Mount Jackson. So they reach Strasburg in 1854 and Mount Jackson in 1859. But this market, the lower Shenandoah Valley, they're going to quickly be headed off at the pass for serving beyond that area. In 1858, the state of Virginia and Claudius Crozet, who has been invited to come back now that the state has seen fit to apologize and give him a brand new railroad project to work on, is going to complete the Blue Ridge Railroad and Blue Ridge Tunnel through the mountains between what is now the town of Crozet and Waynesboro and Charlottesville on the other side. So, looking for new markets, the Manassas Gap officials are going to talk about building a line to Harper's Ferry to connect to the Winchester and Potomac and serve more of the lower valley area. And then also, they're going to stop paying the O&A to use the line between Alexandria and what they call Manassas Junction, which is, according to the post office, a place called Tudor Hall. Today, the city of Manassas. So to avoid that, they're going to build a whole new rail line that's going to cut directly across and avoid Manassas Junction and head all the way straight to Alexandria as level and as cheaply as they can get it built. That's never going to happen, but during the Civil War, that will form an important part of the battlefield landscape during especially the Second Battle of Manassas, when Confederate troops under Jackson will be behind that embankment of the unfinished independent line. Now, ultimately, it is doomed basically to not survive the Civil War. This picture shows what's left of the Manassas Gap Railroad facilities at Manassas Junction, which is smokestacks and boilers and wreckage of a turntable and locomotive here. The Manassas Gap, while the O&A is able to survive with some of its equipment embargoed or repossessed by the Union troops during the war, the Manassas Gap is basically destroyed, other than its physical railroad tracks and grade. So they're going to merge very quickly in 1867 with the Orange and Alexandria, and then will be consumed into the Southern Railway system ultimately, and continue to operate under Southern banner until today, well, Norfolk Southern. So, the Civil War years, 61 to 65, the railroads in Prince William County are going to be a major driving factor in what brings the war to Prince William County. Now, it's kind of inevitable from its position that battles are going to be fought here, but those major rail lines between Alexandria City, Manassas Junction, and further south to Charlottesville and Lynchburg, and then along the eastern part of Prince William County from Quantico, well, not the Quantico area yet, but supporting the Quantico area not far away from Steamboat and from shortened lines to Richmond. Most of the Confederate troops that are going to come up to those Potomac batteries are going to begin their journey in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Texas, and ultimately they will take the cars, as was the contemporary phrase, from Richmond up to the end of the line at Aquia, and then march up the road to their new positions in eastern Prince William County, thus drastically shortening their journey by the rail travel. The campaigns are, mentioned here, going to depend on those rails for years for logistic support, for supplies, for quickness of movement, or easier movement for troops, or at least their supply, until, of course, 1864 and 1865, when the campaigning finally pushes away from Northern Virginia and back into Central Virginia, where the RF&P will remain significant, the Virginia Central, but the O&A and the Manassas Gap will finally get a break. But as I mentioned with the Manassas Gap, part of this is going to be the sheer devastation of the rail lines. Most of them were not built terribly durable to begin with. The company built them about as tough as they needed to be to continue to operate, and not much beyond that. So the rails holding up the whole thing are generally fairly light. By the 1860s, they're no longer what were called strap rails, which is just basically a sheet of iron atop a wood beam beneath it. Those had finally basically been outlawed in most locations because in event of an accident, or even sometimes too much of a severe temperature change, heating or cooling would pop the nails, cause that beam to spring up and catch a wooden coach or locomotive in the underside and spear up through it. So most of them were proper rails by that point, but then they were ripped up by both armies to either deny the use of the railroad or to reuse the rail in the case of the Confederacy for armor for seagoing vessels or river protection vessels down in Richmond and Wilmington and further south are going to use rail seized from both the O&A and from the RF&P. So these companies, when the war ends, are left at best broke, at worst very, very heavily in debt. In the RF&P's case, for spending a lot of money in support of the Confederacy and being paid in Confederate bonds and money that are now worthless. So they struggle to rebuild. They bring in new capital from sources in the north, in the south that had survived with a little bit of money, and by resuming service as quickly as they can. In a lot of cases, this image shows the Bull Run Bridge on the Orange in Alexandria. The piers have survived the war, the masonry work, but the Army had already rebuilt those rail bridges, in some cases 3 or 4 times during the war. And while some of them would last, others would not. They had basically been built as temporary replacements and now had to be permanently replaced. In addition to locomotives and passenger cars and freight wagons that had either been broken up and scrapped or sold or stolen during the war years, or had been stolen and needed to be returned. In the RF&P's case, they had received locomotives taken from the Baltimore and Ohio at Martinsburg, put on rollers basically, brought down the Shenandoah Valley, and then across the Blue Ridge Mountains on the Blue Ridge Railroad, and shuffled around to the RF&P because they needed the equipment. So, that starts us to the actual lines as they come through Prince William County. So with the RF&P, we're going to kind of generally follow a south to north direction, following that Richmond, Fredericksburg, Potomac sort of mindset. Now Quantico, as I mentioned, I'd hope that would show up a little bit better, but it's not really. If you can make out the little lines there, this is a Corps of Engineers survey from the 1880s showing the railroad wharfs there at Quantico. Now there was by that point Quantico or Potomac City. The town itself is down here. But for the purposes of the Corps of Engineers, they didn't care about the town, they just cared about the railroad port facilities. So you can see there, the major pier held a railroad depot, a restaurant, a station for crew changes, excuse me, for drawing water up from the river to supply the locomotives with water, and a coaling station to provide them with coal to burn and generate steam. And then there are also a few sidings to serve for the freight connection to Washington. Now, this facility pretty much once the steamboat operations closed in 1877 is gone. Not quite instantly, but the rails are pulled up, they're reused for other projects, and the piers, the wharf there, are torn off because there's already a new pleasure pier, basically, for the steamboat company that's a little bit better situated in the creek. Now, the town of Quantico itself, or Potomac City, depending on the years in the late 1800s, was at the beginning pretty much just a resort community and a fishing town, essentially. So it didn't have much service, just a basic little RF&P depot. But this picture, 1920s, that is the RF&P depot there on the right, with the railroad tracks in the foreground, double tracked. We'll talk about that in a second. But Quantico, of course, by that point, the Marine Corps base had been constructed, its initial stages at least, which are right up from the railroad depot, the other direction, inland. And the railroad depot is going to be enlarged. It's going to receive more attention from the railroad company because a lot of the construction supplies, brickwork, masonry, workmen, are going to come down from Washington via the railroad. Another factor is simply that by the 19-teens and 20s, steamboat service to Quantico has been drastically reduced, and most Marine Corps recruits or Marine Corps personnel are now going to be coming by rail. Either south, north, however they're going to come, they're going to arrive to the Marine Corps base via the rails. So the railroad needs to expand capacity, especially during the teens, when the base expands during World War I, and then again for World War II to handle that sort of traffic and need for material transport, supplies, and everything else. So Quantico is the first station, the first depot as you come into Prince William County, pretty much right across the line. Now, this brings us a little bit north. We cross Quantico Creek on a great big, today, fairly low bridge. Initially, it was built high enough to have a draw span in the middle to raise and allow steamboats to access Quantico Creek as needed, or more likely the lumber schooners that served the Potomac at that time, carrying firewood and cut lumber. But that burned in the 30s. It burned for quite a long time. Marines came from the base. The firefighters came from as far away as Fairfax to try and extinguish the bridge after it caught fire. But that much heavy creosoted timber burns for quite a long time. So eventually it will be burned bad enough that the draw span is destroyed and they just rebuild it into a simpler bridge. But what the relevance is there, that brings us across to Possum Point, which is initially going to be the connection for Dumfries. Now, if you're a passenger and you're traveling on the railroad and you want to actually travel to the town of Dumfries for whatever reason, for pleasure, business, live there, etc., you have to get off the train at Quantico. There's no option. There's some passenger service via horse and carriage, and later by taxi from Quantico to Dumfries. But there is a connection running to the town of Dumfries, and that is via the American Agricultural Chemical Company's branch industrial railroad. It runs all the way to what's now Prince William Forest Park, to the pyrite mine there. And it is the primary way for the company to transport their bulk pyrite ore to the railroad for then shipment to their plants in New Jersey and New York for turning refinement and turning it into sulfuric acid. So they decide a railroad is the best thing to go. They build a little narrow gauge line. It's oftentimes by folks in Dumfries and that lived or worked near the pyrite mine as the dinky, because it was a dinky little locomotive. They had two. They had a little tank engine, looks something like Ada Thomas the tank engine, but smaller. It just carried enough water and enough coal to basically track back and forth twice between the dock to dump into their RF&P's cars and back to the mine. That wasn't cutting it, so eventually they bought, this is not the locomotive, unfortunately, they bought, but this is the same model. It's known as a Climax Locomotive Works Model A, and if you'll notice, it's a little bit unusual. It has these weird looking things tilted upright, and it also doesn't have wheels all the way underneath like we're used to seeing in a steam locomotive, because this is geared, more like an automobile drive shaft. The steam drives these cylinders at an angle. That drives an eccentric crank down there underneath, which then transmits the power by gears out to the wheels. It's a lot slower than a regular locomotive, but it's a lot stronger. It can pull a lot more for its weight and its size. And this is the last locomotive the company uses before they close in the 1920s. And its entire life, all it would have done is just track back and forth that 4 or 5 miles between the pyrite mine and the railroad to dump pyrite. It then went on to a second life. It went to a lumber company in Pennsylvania where it was scrapped in the 1950s. Now, later on, Possum Point's going to assume a whole other dimension. In the 1950s, when the coal-fired power plant is being constructed there, everything from the turbines and turbine blades down to structural steel and electrical components is going to be brought by the RF&P. And once the plant is finished, the tens of thousands of tons of coal it's going to consume in an operating period are going to be brought exclusively by rail on the RF&P from West Virginia primarily, but Pennsylvania and points further west. To the point that that is the only freight yard the RF&P constructs in Prince William County, is about 7 or 8 tracks to serve the power plant at Possum Point. That brings us up to the next major depot on the line at Cherry Hill. Cherry Hill today has largely been built over by the Potomac Shores development. But if you get down to the end at the river, crossover where Thames River Shore used to be, you'll see there is some rail embedded in the gravel there that's never been pulled out. That is what is left. Unfortunately, this picture is very tall, very narrow. But if you look behind the big tall signal mast here, you see building and building. And on the right, that is the combination freight and passenger depot for Cherry Hill. And on the left is a passenger waiting shelter for northbound traffic. I say northbound traffic despite the fact it is on the left side of the tracks. We think of driving on the road, we drive on the right. The RF&P is one of those unusual North American railroads that drove on the left. So all their trains northbound would be left and southbound on the right as we look at this photo. Today they've changed that around. CSX has made it normal and trains typically progress as they would on other railroads. But Cherry Hill is significant not because it does serve a pretty significant community in Prince William County. Fishermen, hunters, birders, other folks that work in the industries around the area there, in timber as well. But you'll see there is a third track siding and another track here off to the side of the depot. Especially in the early 1900s, Cherry Hill was a major destination for executives or travelers from Washington coming down to hunt, coming down to fish, and otherwise recreate in Northern Virginia. Oftentimes they would come down in a large party with their own private rail cars, built by the Pullman Company or another builder, that are almost like a home on wheels. Everything from a kitchen and stove, bathroom, bedrooms, everything all done up in the highest Victorian fashion to serve their needs as they travel. Now, on the right here, this is still Cherry Hill, but this is actually close to, today, the Cockpit Point Civil War Park. If you've ever had the chance to visit Cockpit Point on one of our programs or have seen photos of the area, below we'll oftentimes point out the older route of the RF&P. Part of the reason they hadn't built north sooner is Cherry Hill itself. The company could not figure out a way to economically build through, over, or around Cherry Hill itself, along with Possum Point, Possum Nose. Eventually, though, they do build around both, but their solution is initially, as you can see from this photo, basically building right on the Potomac shore by blasting a little shelf in the rock and then putting the tracks, a single track, right along the river. Understandably, this doesn't work out great. Not just from flooding, but when the Potomac would ice over very heavily in the late 1800s and early 1900s, ice would get pushed up along the shore and then provide another potential obstacle for locomotives to derail on. So the company looks for a solution, and eventually the option is just, well, we have to spend a lot of money. And they do. One of their largest construction projects is going to be building what's called the Cherry Hill Cut. And today, when you visit the Cherry Hill area down by Thames River Shore, the kayak landing at Potomac Shores, Cockpit Point Civil War Park, you'll see there is a big blasted valley through Cherry Hill that was built to build this double track main line and allow high-speed access to Washington City. Now, of course, this is 1915, so high-speed access means about 60 miles an hour, 60 to 65. And this brings us to the next project to the north, Neabsco Creek. The railroad bridged Powell's Creek, and then it bridges across again from what's now Leesylvania State Park, across the river beyond Rippon Lodge on the point there, on a high bridge again. And today, this and Powell's Creek are two of the only ones that are surviving as higher bridges, essentially. Now, they were both originally all timber. Today, Powell's Creek is almost entirely concrete, and most of Neabsco Creek has been replaced with concrete in places. This photo, as you can see though, the bridge is still all timber, and this photo was taken during a major RF&P construction project in the 1960s that was doing some major overhaul work on the bridge. You can see they pretty much have this whole span pulled up to work on the bridge under deck structure. This was part of the high-speed line operations. This would allow them to then bypass the low grade right along the river and keep a straight course. Pretty much, if you look at it, the railroad on a map today, you'll see once you get to Cherry Hill, it just takes an arrow straight course up until you hit the Occoquan River. Now, this area did present a lot of challenges along with that Cherry Hill cut. When they start building in Neabsco Creek and driving pylons, the company keeps losing pylons. The soil will not take the weight. They keep tipping or they sink further in. So instead, the company then has to tack on a couple $100,000 more in, again, early 1900s currency to dump hundreds and hundreds of tons of earth and gravel and debris into the river to try and stabilize it enough to get a solid bridge footing. And eventually it works, but in that process, they uncover an interesting colonial relic of Prince William County. When they are dumping that material, they accidentally create a suction and pull back the water from a large stretch of the creek. And until their engineers fix that, they expose a line, kind of abreast, of 4 colonial sailing vessels. They said they were colonial, but it could quite easily fit. They were 4 small schooners, and in the bed remaining of the keel of those schooners were loaded with pig iron, which it was thought at the time, and likely was, pig iron that had been cast at the furnace and ironworks upstream here at the Neabsco Furnace, owned by the Taylor family. That would place those boats somewhere between the 1730s and as late as the early 18 teens, potentially. What did they do with those boats? What did they do with that iron? They promptly dumped more dirt on top of it because they were building a bridge. So they were noted down, but if they still exist at all, they are under an entire railroad. So interesting footnote, but we're unlikely to ever really find out more about that. Oops. If they did, they didn't publicize it. So it's hard to say. Well, I won't say that a workman or a company official didn't go home with it, but it's never been sold on the open market, or at least it's not been identified as coming from Neabsco Creek. Now, the other photo there on the right, this shows kind of the railroad line behind the family, but this is taken by the Freestone Depot right across the river, close where the Rippon VRE station is today. Freestone served mainly the farm Freestone and the small surrounding community there. The RF&P could never decide whether they wanted to call this Freestone or Neabsco because of the bridge and the creek. So every couple years, they would change it. It would be Freestone, be Neabsco. Freestone, Neabsco. But eventually they settled on Freestone, and it stayed that way for most of the 20th century. But we'll revisit that problem. 2 names, 1 place. The RF&P had a much more significant problem at Occoquan, or Woodbridge. Because while Freestone, important, not many people living there, no post office. But at Occoquan, you had a post office. Woodbridge, you had a post office. And the depot, in the early days, was Woodbridge. It was built right on top of the hill there, right across at the footing of the railroad bridge today, going into Fairfax County. But Woodbridge, as some folks might remember, was not much of a town. There's a few houses, a few businesses there, the post office, but it's not very big. Occoquan is larger and has more of a business presence. So, if you've ever read Landmarks of Old Prince William, it's mentioned in there, and it's also mentioned in a conversation Fairfax Harrison had, the author of that book, who was an RF&P official. He was an attorney for the company, then later a vice president and president. Yeah, but and also for RF&P as well at different points. But at Occoquan, the debate keeps going back and forth until eventually Woodbridge is what's settled on, essentially, in the 1950s. Mainly because the service to the area has been reduced so much that Occoquan doesn't necessarily care that they have the name on the railroad depot anymore. And the company decides it's just too much of a pain to keep changing it, fighting back and forth. So this photo on the left does show the Occoquan name in 1941. The troops there in front of the depot are from the Virginia Protective Force, the State Guard during World War II. After Pearl Harbor, these men came from Berryville by car. You can see somebody's car there off to the left. Came down to guard the bridges at Quantico and the bridges at Powell's Creek, Neabsco, and Occoquan. So this is the Occoquan Bridge Guard detachment with their officer there at the depot. On the right, this photo is taken in the late 1950s, and you can see there is the final Woodbridge title. So this is the passenger depot, and that is the freight depot that was across the railroad tracks next to the road. And if I click it over, this is looking southbound. There is the freight depot from that right-hand photo, and there is the passenger depot on the other side. Big structure over here was a sawmill. That was one of the major customers for the railroad in Woodbridge/Occoquan, along with the businesses in Occoquan. And this locomotive, or train, is moving southbound down Prince William County, coming off the bridge. And here today, end of the RF&P in Prince William County, and perhaps one of its most well-known and well-noticed features is the RF&P bridge there at Occoquan. This is, on the left, the current standing bridge with one of the RF&P's governor-class locomotives running on top of it, named after Virginia's colonial and early governors. And it is running on the modern bridge that was finished in 1912. That was the third bridge the company had built. The first one was a low bridge for the old rail line, and then the second bridge was a little bit higher up. That was damaged in a flood, and they built this new bridge in 1912, and that's the one that's still being used today with regular maintenance and repair work. On the right, another well-known photo. It's a little bit difficult to see, but down here, and then here, that is the old RF&P bridge, which was donated to the Virginia Department of Highways, later VDOT, who then constructed the Route 1 highway bridge on top of those low masonry piers for originally the single span, 2-lane span across, which was then improved with a second span, 2-lane span to the side. During Hurricane Agnes, that came down. The masonry had already been weakened. It was known to be a potential problem, but not a serious issue until the massive amount of debris and water pressure coming down the Occoquan River made it a problem and brought down the bridge. So that was the end of that old bridge, and you can still see the remains of those masonry piers there in the Occoquan River. Now there's one thing that's not really visible today because they didn't get very far in it. In 1855, RF&P talks about reaching Washington not by following the Potomac, but by building as far as Quantico and cutting across the middle of Prince William County to meet the O&A at Manassas Junction and make that a 3-way junction. It doesn't get any further really than the planning stage. They submit a report to the state from their engineer recommending a route, crossing Broad Run at Sinclair's Mill, and coming through Brentsville and then on to the junction at Tudor Hall. So this is something I made, so it's not exactly great, but this is a rough approximation of the route the company would have taken through central Prince William County, potentially drastically altering the landscape of development through the county. But one way or the other, it was not built, and after the war, the company did not revisit it. They revisited building to Quantico, but then decided to continue north through Prince William County in a direct route to Washington, rather than having to deal with the Southern Railway Company. So we are going to move along across the county, closer to us right now, at the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. Again, this one, not really a way to make it easily bigger, but this map does show the entire route between Orange and Alexandria, with us right about there. So again, we're going to follow south to north, the opposite way the railroad was built, because I did it that way with the first one, and I decided to do it that way with the second one. So coming into Prince William County, one of the first structures you would encounter along the railroad is what is today the Ayden Road Bridge. It was originally a railroad bridge. It was on the Virginia Central line down closer to Fredericksburg. When the railroad built a new bridge, proved bridge, there was a long-running cry to eliminate the grade crossing here at Ayden, between Ayden and Oaksville and the main highway 28. So after a long stretch of back and forth and complaints and people getting hit by trains, the company finally agreed to slightly lower the roadbed into a cut and move this old surplus bridge here to use as a road bridge. Today, it's been restored by VDOT. It is right there along with the modern bridge to increase and improve traffic flow. There's a little pull-off, if you ever want to check it off closer, that has a Civil War trail sign, and soon a sign specifically about that. Now, on the right, our first depot north of there, and first depot in the county, is going to be Bristow Station. Famous Battlefield Park. I know I see Kevin clapping in the back for Bristow Station. That is the Bristow Station. Now, that's not the 1861 Bristow Station. That station is flattened. Every building around the railroad is flattened. But in the 1850s, there was a station, there was a water stop and fuel stop, at the time split firewood, as well as a railroad hotel, a tavern right there by the railroad, in addition to a farm fairly close by there as well, and the Davis farm not much further away. It was built basically to serve Brentsville and that surrounding area along through there. Not quite as far as Haymarket and all that. We'll talk about that in a moment. This depot was built likely in the 1880s, 1870s. It's what oftentimes O&A or later Southern Railway historians have called the R&D style, Richmond and Danville. At the time, they were the parent company that owned the Orange and Alexandria and built several depots in this style along its newly acquired rail lines. It's basically a combination passenger waiting room and agent's office on the side to handle all the ticketing and freight business and things like that. And on the left is the freight room. And it's hard to see in this picture, but if you can make it out right there in front of the freight room, one of the staples shipped out from Bristow is milk. And there's a couple milk cans sitting there waiting for loading on the next train through north. So this brings us up to where we are today. Tudor Hall, or Manassas Junction, or Manassas, just plain old Manassas if you prefer. So Tudor Hall, won't have to reiterate that too much, but when the railroad was built through the area, it's basically just the neighboring farms and homes. So this is a Civil War era letter with the Confederate Postal Service stamp for Tudor Hall. Most mail that came in was addressed to Manassas Junction because that's what was in the newspapers, but all the mail going out is stamped Tudor Hall by the postmaster here. And then, of course, you can see the junction here off to the right, turntable for the Manassas Gap, and more of that ruined equipment right here in the middle of the fortifications and structures. So, here we have Manassas Depot, 1969 on the left, and in 1950, with the Chesapeake and Ohio's fast-flying Virginian cruising right through town at maximum speed. Get back to that in a second. But the depot, of course, restored today, not looking very much different than in this photo here, other than a little bit more built around it. And here is an actual track plan from Southern Railway of what Manassas Junction looked like about 1916. So you can see the Manassas Gap curving off this way, and you can see the main tracks, the yard, depot, and other facilities right here in what is now downtown. You also have the Manassas Gap Railroad itself. By the time that plan is made in 1916, it is a branch of the Southern Railway, and it has reached as far as Harrisonburg, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley. It is colloquially known as the Weed Line for reasons that are pretty self-explanatory. It's not very well looked after. It's kind of considered a low priority by the company, headquartered down in Atlanta, but it provides a vital service to the Shenandoah Valley. Trains twice daily, mixed trains, which include freight and passengers, and then regular freight service. There on the left, the Broad Run water tank, technically a feature that is barely in Prince William County, but what makes it interesting is it is a remnant of the pre-war Manassas Gap. This stone foundation was, according to company records and longtime employees, originally built by the enslaved laborers that did much of the contract work building the railroad line, and then later was expanded into a larger water facility as time went on. And then on the right, completely out of Prince William County, but very important to the railroad, is the Harrisonburg Terminal, or engine house, where locomotives would be serviced, oiled, fueled, any repairs made, and then turned around and sent back to Manassas. We also have a feature that was very temporary but very important to the railroad, the Spanish-American War Camp at Thoroughfare Gap. This map shows there is the rail line coming through the middle of Thoroughfare Gap, and there we have the Army camps spread around the various fields and farms of Thoroughfare Gap. with special sidings added to serve the troop trains, which would also be repeated for the Army maneuvers about a decade later. So, I mentioned the C&O speeding through Manassas. The C&O did not own the tracks through Manassas, the Southern Railway did. But C&O wanted to get its big name trains, big fancy passenger service trains, to Washington City. They could either take them all the way to Richmond and then bring them all the way up the RF&P, or they could cut that off by splitting the train at Charlottesville and sending one half of it east to Richmond and Newport News, and sending one half north to Washington via the old O&A. However, as part of that agreement, those trackage rights to secure use of the tracks, they had to agree not to serve the same stations the Southern Railway did, and thus compete for passenger service. So, C&O did not stop in Manassas except for the FFV. And the only exception is if you were traveling to a destination beyond those served by the railway. If you were traveling beyond Charlottesville, you could board going south. If you're traveling beyond Washington, you could travel going north on the FFV. And these photos, that's a timetable. This is the George Washington headed south from Alexandria towards Manassas in 1969. And this is the end of the Manassas, or O&A, in Prince William County going north. That is the Bull Run Bridge. This is, as I mentioned, I showed the picture of the military bridge, but there is the footers for the railroad bridge and the temporary military span in 1862 that bridged the railroad crossing there. And this is a photo, 1989. This shows today the main track of the railroad there, and then the stone old masonry piers built into and concreted into the modern railroad bridge.
Where is that located?
That is north of Signal Hill, kind of going towards Clifton. So I don't know that there's really any way to access that. It's pretty much just right off the railroad grade. Yeah, I was going to say it's close up to the golf course, though. You can kind of see it. Yeah. So this brings us to the modern era. 1971 is a watershed year for American railroading. One, again, imagine a lot of folks remember. Almost all passenger service ceases on America's railroads in 1971. The United States government has funded Amtrak, which will take over most passenger service throughout the country. But initially, that's not going to impact Prince William County too much because the Southern Railway continues to have their own trains run by their own crews on Southern rails. So coming through Manassas on the old O&A, you'll continue to have the Southern Railway, but the old C&O trains are now being run by Amtrak, and they will stop at the Manassas Depot for most of those years. RF&P, on the other hand, they continued to serve local and commuter service through 1957, at which point the last two local trains between Richmond and Washington are discontinued for lack of ridership, despite a large protest filed by several Prince William County residents in Quantico, Freestone, and Cherry Hill. Amtrak services, James Whitcomb Riley, eventually became the Cardinal. And then, of course, the Virginia Rail Express, VRE, begins service along the CSX and Norfolk Southern lines in the summer of 1992 and restores commuter service to Prince William County by rail. And there on the right, that is the last timetable issued by the RF&P, where you can still read that it is service via the RF&P for the National Passenger Railroad Corporation, which was the working name for Amtrak. One last note, technically railroad. Eventually, or ultimately, in 1962, the Washington Metropolitan Transit Authority published their first plan for what would become the Metro. It was very different than the plan they ultimately went with, partially because it included Metro service to Woodbridge. Coming all the way out, either on or parallel to the RF&P lines. RF&P said absolutely not for using their tracks, but they would consider using the right-of-way to provide light rail service out here for passengers. These diagrams reproduced about as bad as I was afraid they would, because they're beige on beige. But these show the sketches the Transit Authority developed to give to builders for what they were looking for their new transit cars. So again, very different from what we ultimately got from Metro. And this is a very tiny list, but this gives you just kind of an idea of all the different railroad corporations, the names that have served this county, and their ultimate fates. Eventually we end up with the CSX Transportation Company, beginning in 1986, and Norfolk Southern will purchase will be combined, Norfolk Western Railway and the Southern Railway combined together and will operate the old O&A line. And CSX will acquire the RF&P line in 1991. Although it takes several years to complete the corporate merger, by that point it's functionally being run by CSX and connected into their lines across the river into Maryland on what had been Conrail and B&O and Reading and everything else. Image credits, anybody afterwards, if you want to know more about the different pictures they use, we do have full image credits and bibliography. And thank you for coming.